The livestock hauler backed up to the county shelter's overflow pen on a Thursday morning, with 60 piglets nobody had come to claim. Animals seized 3 weeks earlier from a hoarding case that had made the local paper for all the wrong reasons. Half of them were underweight enough that the county vet had already recommended euthanizing the worst of the litter rather than spending shelter resources trying to save what looked, by any practical measure, like a lost cause. The other half weren't much better off, scoured with mange, ribs showing, the kind of animals that made grown men look away, out of something closer to guilt than pity. Nobody at the shelter expected the 17-year-old boy standing at the fence that morning to say anything at all. He'd been coming by most Saturdays for 2 months, doing court-ordered community service hours, mucking stalls and hauling feed without much conversation, the kind of quiet that shelter staff had learned not to push on. But that Thursday he stood at the rail a long time looking at those 60 piglets, and then he asked the shelter director, a tired woman named Corinne Askew, what was going to happen to them. She told him plainly. The healthy ones would go up for adoption eventually, maybe. The rest would likely be put down within the week, because the shelter didn't have the staff, the space, or the budget to nurse 60 compromised piglets back to health, not with everything else already stretched thin. He asked if he could take them instead. All of them, not just the ones with a real chance. Corinne looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone asking a question that doesn't fit the person asking it. He was 17, a ward of the state, living in his 4th foster placement in 3 years on a property that raised exactly nothing beyond a few backyard chickens. He had no land of his own, no money, and by most accounts a file at the county office, thick with the kind of history that made adults assume the worst about follow-through. If you believe the kids everyone's already given up on sometimes turn out to be exactly the ones worth betting on, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. His name was Marcus Teale, and he'd come into the foster system at 11, after his mother's addiction finally cost her custody for good, cycling through 6 placements in 6 years by the time he landed with the Holloways, a retired couple in their 60s who ran a modest 12 acres on the edge of the county mostly as a hobby, a few chickens and an old vegetable garden that Ray Holloway kept more out of habit than ambition. Marcus had been with them 8 months by the time the piglets came up, longer than any single placement he'd had before. Though even he would have told you it was a fragile kind of longer, the sort that could still end with one bad week. He'd been sentenced to community service after a shoplifting charge the spring before, food mostly, taken from a gas station during a stretch between placements when nobody had been checking whether he was eating regularly. The judge, an older woman who'd seen enough kids in his position to read between the lines of the police report, had assigned him to the county shelter instead of anything harsher, a decision Marcus hadn't understood the reasoning behind until months later. What made him ask about the piglets that Thursday wasn't sentiment. Not exactly. It was recognition, though he couldn't have explained it that clearly at 17. He'd spent years being the animal nobody wanted to invest resources in, moved along whenever he became inconvenient, and something about 60 scoured, starving piglets slated for euthanasia because saving them cost more than anyone wanted to spend, hit a nerve he didn't have words for. Yet Corinne, against what she later admitted was her better professional judgment, made some calls. The Holloways, when Marcus asked them that evening at dinner, exchanged a long look before Ray finally said they had the land, if Marcus was serious about doing the work, and if the county would sign off on the liability. It took 2 more weeks of paperwork and a home visit from an unusually patient caseworker before the shelter formally released the herd into Marcus's care. Technically under Ray Holloway's name since Marcus was still a minor, but everyone involved understood who Project actually was. There was one person in the county who might actually know how to save 60 compromised piglets, and that was a retired large animal veterinarian named Dr. Owen Kessler, 72 years old, who'd run the county's primary livestock practice for 4 decades before handing it off to a younger partner, and mostly kept to himself since. except for the occasional consult he took on for cases nobody else wanted to touch. Corinne had worked with him for years and made the introduction, warning Marcus honestly that Owen didn't suffer fools and had even less patience for people who weren't serious. Owen drove out to the Holloway place the first weekend the Piglets arrived, took one look at the herd crowded into a hastily repaired section of an old hog shed nobody had used in a decade, and told Marcus flatly that at least a third of what he was looking at probably wouldn't survive the month regardless of what anyone did, and that the rest would need round-the-clock attention most 17-year-olds weren't built for. Marcus asked him to teach him anyway. Owen looked at him a long moment, the particular look of a man deciding whether someone was serious or just scared and stubborn, and said, "Sit down then, if you mean it." That was the beginning of something neither of them fully expected. Owen became something between a teacher and a skeptic in residence over the following weeks, refusing to make anything easy, insisting Marcus learn to read a sick animal's condition by hand before he'd let him near medication. He explained that most of what killed compromised young pigs wasn't the original neglect itself but what came after. Dehydration nobody caught in time, secondary infections moving through weakened immune systems, temperature swings that stressed already fragile bodies past what they could recover from. Most people think saving something starved is about the food, Owen told him one evening, checking a piglet's gum color under a flashlight. It's really about catching the small things going wrong before they become the big thing that kills it. Marcus's first real mistake nearly cost him a third of the herd in a single week. He'd followed feeding instructions almost too literally, ramping up portions too quickly on digestive systems that had spent weeks malnourished and couldn't handle the sudden richness, and watched 6 piglets develop severe scours within days. Owen didn't sugarcoat it when Marcus called him in a panic. "You fed the number on the page instead of the animal in front of you," he said. "Numbers are a starting point. You still have to watch what the body's actually telling you." Marcus rebuilt his approach around close observation after that, the kind of patience that hadn't come naturally to a kid who'd spent years learning that attention from adults was unreliable and often temporary. He started keeping a notebook, at Owen's insistence, tracking weight, appetite, and behavior for every animal individually, instead of managing the herd as one undifferentiated group, a habit, Owen said, mattered more than any single medication he could prescribe. The mange proved to be its own slow battle, requiring weeks of treatment and careful monitoring to keep secondary skin infections from taking hold in already weakened animals. Marcus lost 4 more piglets over the first month despite everything, each loss landing harder than the last, though Owen made a point of telling him plainly each time that the loss rate he was managing was, given the starting condition of the herd, better than most professional operations would have achieved. Word moved through town the way it always did in a county that size, most of it unkind at first. A few people at the diner joked that the Holloways had let some troubled foster kid play farmer with a shelter's worth of dying pigs, and that it would end the way most of these things ended. Ray's own brother asked him, half serious, if he thought that was really a smart use of the boy's time given his record. Ray mostly stayed quiet and let Marcus work. Marcus heard some of it secondhand, the way kids in his position usually did, filtered through the careful silences of adults trying to protect him from things they assumed he couldn't handle. He'd learned a long time ago not to let that kind of talk change what he did with his hands. It was, in its own way, the same skill Owen was teaching him with the pigs. You didn't manage what people said about you any more than you managed a fever by wishing it gone. You just kept doing the next necessary thing and let the results speak whenever they were ready to. But not everyone dismissed it. Corinne started stopping by on her days off, just to check on the herd's progress, standing at the fence rail with something that looked increasingly like professional pride rather than obligation. And Owen, despite grumbling constantly about how much of his retirement Marcus was eating into, started showing up unprompted more often than the arrangement technically required, sometimes with nothing more than a bag of feed supplement he claimed he'd had extra of, though Marcus noticed he never seemed to have extra of anything when it came to his own herd. The turning point came during an unseasonable cold snap in early spring that dropped temperatures well below what the makeshift shed had been built to handle. Several of the county's small hobby operations lost young stock that week to hypothermia and exposure. Marcus, who'd spent the preceding month building supplemental heating into the shed, using scavenged materials and a wiring setup Ray had helped him make safe, didn't lose a single piglet through the whole cold stretch, staying up most of 2 nights checking temperatures by hand and adjusting heat lamps to keep every corner of the shed within safe range. That got attention in a way explanations never could have. By late spring, the herd that had arrived starving and scoured with mange had grown into 51 healthy, thriving pigs. The improvement dramatic enough that Corinne began quietly using photos of the transformation in shelter fundraising materials, crediting the 17-year-old who'd taken on a case everyone else had written off. But spring wasn't finished testing him. In early summer, Marcus noticed something wrong with 3 of his strongest pigs, animals he'd been especially proud of pulling back from the worst of the original neglect. They'd gone off feed and seemed unusually lethargic. When he called Owen, the older man drove out immediately, and after examining the animals, told Marcus it looked like early signs of a respiratory infection moving through that section of the herd, the kind that could spread fast in close quarters if not caught and isolated immediately. "This is the part nobody tells you about taking on something this compromised," Owen said, packing up his kit. "It's not really about the big rescue moment. It's about noticing trouble early enough to still do something about it." Marcus isolated the affected animals that same day, exactly as Owen instructed, and the infection, caught early, cost him nothing further. It was a small crisis in the scope of everything he'd already survived that spring, but it taught him something that stuck harder than any single success had. Keeping something alive wasn't a finished project. It was something you had to keep watching, every single day, the same way you'd watch over anything worth keeping. By that summer, Marcus had built a genuine small operation out of what had started as 60 condemned piglets, selling weaned pigs to other small hobby farms and 4-H families around the county, reinvesting every dollar back into better fencing and feed storage. He kept the prices lower than he probably could have gotten away with, a decision Owen questioned once and then never questioned again after Marcus explained, a little embarrassed, that he remembered what it felt like to need something and not be able to afford it, and he'd rather sell a healthy pig to a family who'd take care of it than squeeze the last dollar out of someone who couldn't. Word of the transformation reached the county 4-H program, and a coordinator reached out asking whether Marcus would consider mentoring younger kids in the program, an idea that would have seemed impossible to him 8 months earlier. Owen, for his part, never quite stopped correcting Marcus's technique, though the corrections got smaller and less frequent as the months passed. Ray and his wife, watching the operation grow from their kitchen window most evenings, began talking quietly about what it might mean to make Marcus's placement with them permanent, conversations that had started tentatively and were growing less tentative by the week. The judge who'd originally sentenced Marcus to community service heard about the herd secondhand, through Corinne, and asked to see it for herself one Saturday that fall. She stood at the fence for a long while, watching Marcus work through the herd, checking each animal by hand the way Owen had taught him, and she told Corinne afterward that in 15 years on the bench, she'd rarely seen a community service placement turn into something quite like this. By the following year, Marcus was running close to 80 pigs across an expanded section of the Holloway property, with a standing arrangement supplying weaned stock to 4 different families in the county. He'd learned, without anyone formally teaching him this part, how to price fairly, how to keep records the way a small business needed rather than the way a hobby did, and how to say no to a sale when a buyer's setup wasn't ready for the animal, even when the money would have helped. Corinne still stopped by most weekends, less out of professional obligation now than genuine friendship. Owen, well into his 70s, still showed up more than he ever admitted was necessary, saying little, correcting less, mostly just watching a kid he'd once given a month's odds of quitting build something steady and real. The county didn't change overnight. But something in the way people looked at Marcus did. A foster kid with a shoplifting charge on his file stopped being someone people quietly worried about and became someone a few of them started, cautiously, to admire. What he'd built wasn't flashy. It wasn't a business empire or a dramatic redemption arc with a tidy ending. It was a small, patient system of saved animals. A family that had stopped being temporary in every way that mattered, and proof that most of what the county had written off as a lost cause just needed someone willing to look closer and ask why instead of assuming they already knew the answer. He still keeps that first notebook Owen made him start, filled now with 2 years of careful daily notes instead of a few uncertain pages. And every spring, when new piglets come through the gate, a few more people in that county remember exactly why they used to doubt him, and exactly why they don't anymore. If you've ever been written off as a lost cause and proven it wrong anyway, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about people the world gave up on too soon.